Welcome. Now we're working on the problem 4/5 times 1/2 x minus 1/10 is equal to 3/10. Our goal is to find out what number x should be. My guess is if you're here today, you're probably here for one of two reasons. Either you're trying to sort out which operation should we do first. Notice we have two multiplications and a subtraction. We're trying to get the order correct. The other possibility is that you're here because these fractions are quite unpleasant to work with. And let me say that if you are not enjoying working with the fractions, it makes you fairly normal for a college algebra student. But I would say be persistent, keep with it, and hopefully someday you'll come to appreciate working with fractions more than other sort of decimals, or than decimals or other representations of the number. But it's a long process, and fractions are tricky for everyone. So first, let's talk about which operation to do first. And the operation that we're going to do first is we're going to move from the outside in. And so when I look at this equation, I see that 1/2 x, so x was first multiplied by 1/2. Then, second, we subtracted 1/10. And then third, we multiplied by 4/5. So this 4/5, in my mind, is the last thing that happened. It's the outside. It was the last part to interact with x, so it's going to be the first part that we remove. We're always going to remove them in the opposite order from which they came. Now, since this 4/5 is multiplied, what are we going to do to it? We're going to divide by 4/5, because that's the way to undo a multiplication, is to divide by 4/5. Now let's think just for a minute. You'll see what we have on the left-hand side. Left-hand side, these 4/5 divide to give us 1, and so that means we have 1/2 x minus 1/10 all by itself. But now, what is going to happen with this division? Well, like I said, if you're uncomfortable working with fractions, then this division is probably giving you a little bit of a challenge. But let's write it out and see if we can remember. So we have 3/10 divided by 4/5, and the question is, what is this going to equal? Well, if you want, I have a very detailed explanation of how to think about fractions, and particularly how to think about dividing fractions, and you can click on this link and that will take you there. But just in summary, the big conclusion that we come to is when we divide by fractions, it's the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. So it's the same as multiplying by 5/4. So this dividing by the 4/5 is the same as multiplying by the 5/4. You see the two flipped places. And now we multiply across here. We get 15/40. We could have simplified. You could have simplified before you multiplied, or you could simplify this. I'm actually just going to keep it at 15/40 because it's going to be a little bit easier for us later in the problem. But if you simplified, that's just fine. The problem will work out. Let's put 15/40. Let me just say a quick little note, and the quick little note is noticing that since dividing by 5/4 and dividing by 4/5 and multiplying by 5/4 is the same thing. So I could have written, if I wanted, instead of writing the division here, I could have written 5/4 multiplied. And what you'll notice is if I multiplied by 5/4, I would have had the same thing going. 5 divided by 5 and 4 divided by 4 would have both given me 1. It's the same reason why we divide, because 5/4 and 4/5 are inverse operations when they multiply by each other. So multiplying by 5/4 is an inverse operation for multiplying by 4/5. So I could have just written multiply by 5/4 on both sides of the equation, and that would have been equally appropriate. Okay, so that gives us the point where we're at in the problem, which is 1/2 x minus 1/10 equals 15/40. Now we're at the situation where I look through and I see that what's the next piece to get rid of? It's the subtraction on the end, and so I want to add 1/10 to both sides. Add 1/10 to both sides. Now, when we add, the most important principle, really in all of dealing with fractions, is that every time we add, we always have to deal with common denominators. And so this 1/10, I don't want to think of it as 1/10, I want to find my common denominator. And now you see why I left it at 40. I cheat, I'm the teacher, I kind of knew what was going to happen. If you'd simplified, this would have been an 8. You'd have had to scale up to make it a common denominator. But notice that our common denominator of 40 works out well. So let's write this as 4/40. Important note on the common denominator, I didn't actually change the number. It's the same number. I just multiplied both the top and bottom by 40 so that the two numbers have the same numerator. Now, if I look closely at these, I see I have 15 over 40 plus 5 over 40. That means I have 19/40. Notice 40ths is just telling us the size of the individual pieces. This says I have 15 of those 40th pieces. This one says I have 4 of those 40th pieces. I put them together and I have 19 of the 40th pieces. Okay, we're almost done. So we're at this point where we have 1/2 x. We have a choice. We can either divide by a half or multiply by 2. What if I choose to multiply by 2 instead? I can choose to multiply by 2, and if I multiply by 2, then notice that multiplying by 2 and multiplying by a half are inverse operations of each other. So that gives me x on the left. On the right, I can multiply 19 by 2, which gives me 38. 38 over 40, or if I want to reduce it, this is the same as 19 over 20. 19 over 20 is a little bit prettier answer. We usually like things reduced, but they're the same number, just different representations of it. Well, good luck. If you find working with these fractions difficult, one, I would say that you're normal, but two, I would say that the way to overcome this is by getting more experience. So I would encourage you to go back and work some of the problems from the section on fractions and hopefully become more comfortable with these situations.